All right, guys, this is Thursday, and we're starting a new story. This is our last one. We read The Shadow over Innsmouth in the first part of quarter four, and now we're going to read a story that is pretty much the same length, but the difference is it's divided into a lot more chapters. So each chapter is really short, and we can read one, maybe you read one, alternate, something like that. The language is pretty similar too. This is from 1886, but it's sort of ahead of its time a little bit, whereas Shadow over Innsmouth was from 1930, but it was very old-fashioned, so they almost kind of meet in the middle and end up being similarly readable. There are a couple words you'll need to look up, but otherwise it's, well, right here on this website, it's ranked as a 9th grade reading level, so should be pretty good. I'm going to read the first chapter for you guys in this video, and this is a story that's very popular. It's been around forever, so you can find audiobooks, you can find performances, you can find all kinds of stuff, or even on this site you can just hit play and hear a recording. But my version, where I'm going to read this, I'm not just going to read the thing through. I'm going to stop, point out things that are important, point out some words you might not know, point out some things that I'm going to ask you about later in the assignments and so on. So if you just want to read it, you can do that. But if you want to have a little more analysis and so on, that's what this video is for. However, I don't want to make it super long, so I'll get started and we'll see how it goes. Just a quick recap of the basics. This is a story by a guy named Robert Louis Stevenson, and he's famous for some other stories that you may have heard of, like Treasure Island, which even if you haven't read, you may have seen, adaptations or Disney versions or something like that. He also wrote one called Kidnapped, which is very famous, and he's from Scotland. A few years ago, I went to Edinburgh in Scotland, and they're always pointing out, like, oh, this is where Stevenson grew up, or they have other writers, this is where Arthur Conan Doyle wrote his stories and things like that. Well, all right, I'll just get started. I was going to ramble some more. Let's get going. So this begins, as a lot of 1800s stories do, with a little framing device, like it's not just the narrator telling us, it's like, oh, this guy told this guy, which ended up getting to us in some roundabout way. And let's see how that goes. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye, something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in those silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone, to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theater, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering almost with envy at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. I incline to Cain's heresy, he used to say. I let my brother go to the devil in his quaintly own way. In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And to such as these, so long as they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanor. So our main character here is not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We're going to meet them a little later, but it's a sort of neutral viewer to this sort of horror that we're going to see. It reminds me a lot of the beginning of The Great Gatsby. If you guys read The Great Gatsby in English class, it talks about Nick, the main character Nick, and the very first paragraph is him saying, like, I try not to judge people. And people always love to come tell me their stories, even if they're really boring. People just love to pick on me and, spill their guts. So Mr. Utterson is kind of like that, where people come to him and they're friendly, and he just takes it. Not really extreme, just people get along with him, including some bad people or people on the way down. Maybe they're getting into drugs or something. And Utterson will just kind of say, yeah, okay, and just kind of let it slide instead of intervening. No doubt the feat was easy to Mr. Utterson, for he was undemonstrative at the best, and even his friendship seemed to be founded in a similar catholicity of good nature. It is the mark of a modest man to accept his friendly circle ready-made from the hands of opportunity, and that was the lawyer's way. His friends were those of his own blood or those whom he had known the longest. His affections, like ivy, were the growth of time. They implied no aptness in the object. Hence, no doubt, the bond that united him to Richard Enfield, his distant kinsman, the well-known man about town. It was a nut to crack for many what these two could see in each other, or what subject they could find in common. It was reported by those who encountered them in their Sunday walks that they said nothing, looked singularly dull, and would hail with obvious relief the appearance of a friend. For all that, the two men put the greatest store by these excursions, counted them the chief jewel of each week, and not only set aside occasions of pleasure, but even resisted the calls of business that they might enjoy them uninterrupted. So now we got our second character. Utterson, our main guy, has a friend named Richard Enfield, a distant kinsman, so maybe, a second cousin or something further than that, where they wouldn't normally be friends. They wouldn't, meet every day the way immediate family might, but something about the two has grown together. And it says Utterson's affections are like ivy. So they'll grow on a wall, or they'll grow on a fence, or they'll grow on anything. And it's not about the appropriateness of that thing. It's just about if there's enough time, he'll become attached. And Enfield is not like that. Enfield is what they say, a man about town. So very sociable, probably a little more rich, probably a little more entertaining guy, but somehow they have become friends. And every week they go on a walk. It chanced on one of these rambles that their way led them down a by-street in a busy quarter of London. The street was small and what is called quiet, but it drove a thriving trade on the weekdays. The inhabitants were all doing well, it seemed, and all emulously hoping to do better still, and laying out the surplus of their gains in coquetry, so that the shop fronts stood along that thoroughfare with an air of invitation, like rows of smiling saleswomen. Even on Sunday, when it veiled its more florid charms and lay comparatively empty of passage, the street shone out in contrast to its dingy neighborhood, like a fire in a forest. And with its freshly painted shutters, well-polished brasses, and general cleanliness and gaiety of note, instantly caught and pleased the eye of the passenger. So they're going down a street which is like a sort of farmer's market, not just vegetables, but they'll also sell clothes and whatever else. But it's people who are not rich, but they're making a little bit of money, and they're hoping to make more, and they're decorating their stalls very nice and inviting, almost in a flirting way. That's what that word coquetry means. It's sort of like flirty and welcoming and adventurous. These guys are walking down this street, and even when this street does not have an active market, it still looks a little bit shiny, a little bit decorated more than the others. 2 doors from one corner, on the left hand going east, the line was broken by the entry of a court. And just at that point, a certain sinister block of building thrust forward its gable onto the street. It was 2 stories high, showed no window, nothing but a door on the lower story, and a blind forehead of discolored wall on the upper, and bore in every feature the marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. The door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and disdained. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the moldings, and for close on a generation no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. So in the middle of this street that is nice and new and shiny and bright, there's one sort of haunted house looking thing. It's dark, and it's got this gate, and people mess with it. Homeless men sleep in there and light their cigarettes, and boys will carve a little graffiti in there, and nobody has repaired it. It still looks pretty good because it was such a big, strong, solid gate, but it hasn't been kept well. There's no maintenance crew or anything. Mr. Infield and the lawyer were on the other side of the by street. When they came abreast of the entry, the former lifted up his cane and pointed. "Did you ever remark that door?" he asked, and when his companion had replied in the affirmative, "It is connected in my mind," added he, "with a very odd story." "Indeed," said Mr. Utterson with a slight change of voice. "And what was that?" And now we have this giant paragraph, so we're going to get into the anecdote that starts us off. We have our two guys walking down the street, and they're important, especially Utterson is important, but obviously the title of this story is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so we need to hear about them, and they're the ones who actually do stuff, just like in The Great Gatsby. It's about Gatsby and Daisy, not Nick, even though we follow Nick and see it through his eyes. So we're going to get this big paragraph, and I'm going to tell a little anecdote about something that happened a while ago. And then we'll see what happens from there. "Well, it was this way," returned Mr. Infield. "I was coming home from some place at the end of the world about 3 o'clock of a black winter morning, and my way lay through a part of town where there was literally nothing to be seen but lamps. Street after street, and all the folks asleep. Street after street, all lighted up as if for a procession, and all as empty as a church. Till at last I got into that state of mind when a man listens and listens and begins to long for the sight of a policeman. All at once I saw 2 figures. One, a little man who was stumping along eastward at a good walk, and the other, a girl of maybe 8 or 10, who was running as hard as she was able down a cross street. Well, sir, the 2 ran into one another naturally enough at the corner, and then came the horrible part of the thing. For the man trampled calmly over the child's body and left her screaming on the ground. It sounds nothing to hear, but it was hellish to see. It wasn't like a man, it was like some damn juggernaut. I gave a view halloo, took to my heels, collared my gentleman, and brought him back to where there was already quite a group about the screaming child. He was perfectly cool and made no resistance, but gave me one look so ugly that it brought out the sweat on me like running. Perfectly cool. Wait, I skipped the line. Sweat on me like running. So this guy saw a strange man just run into a kid and just trample over her and run by as if this guy was just a bull or something. Didn't stop himself, didn't say sorry, was really violent and strange about it. And people grabbed him, like, "Hey, what are you doing? We gotta stop this. Call the police," whatever. And our guy, Infield, grabbed, it said his gentleman, which is like, his butler, or I think in England at the time they would have used the word valet, V-A-L-E-T. We pronounce valet. So the people who had turned out were the girl's own family. Pretty soon the doctor for whom she had been sent puts in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worse, more frightened according to the Sawbones. In this case, Sawbones is a nickname for doctors that they used at the time. And there you might have supposed would have been an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. Oh, hang on. When he's using the word gentleman, he means this guy, not his own gentleman. So had the child's family, which would have been only natural. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut-and-dry apothecary of no particular age and color, with a strong Edinburgh accent, and about as emotional as a bagpipe. Well, sir, he was like the rest of us. Every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones turned sick and white with the desire to kill him. I knew what was in his mind, just as he knew what was in mine. And killing being out of the question, we did the next best. We told the man we could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. If he had any friends or any credit, we undertook that he should lose them. And all the times we were pitching it in red hot, we were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were as wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces. And there was the man in the middle with a kind of black, sneering coolness. Frightened, too, I could see that. But carrying it off, sir, really like Satan. So they grab this guy, and everyone is just instantly hating him. Like, they take a look at him and they think this is some monster, this is some fiend that we must threaten and beat up and everything else. He says he looks at the doctor, and the doctor instantly wants to kill him. And the doctor looks at this guy, and he knows the same thing is in his mind. But instead they threaten him. They say, hey, look, we're going to ruin your reputation and your credit, and so on. If you choose to make capital out of this accident, said he, I am naturally helpless. No gentleman but wishes to avoid a scene, says he. Name your figure. Well, we screwed him up to £100 for the child's family. He would have clearly liked to stick out, but there was something about the lot of us that meant mischief, and at last he struck. So they basically extort him. They say, hey, look, you're going to give £100 to this child's family to make up for your crime, and then we'll call it even. And he, even though this guy is kind of wild, and you can tell he wants to fight it, he wants to threaten them back or run away. He can tell that this crowd is just bloodthirsty. They want to tear him apart. Not just the man and the doctor, but all the women and all the people gathering around. The next thing was to get the money. And where do you think he carried us but to that place with the door? That place they were talking about a moment ago, where it's this sort of abandoned, strange gate. Whipped out a key, went in, and presently came back with the matter of £10 in gold and a cheque for the balance, drawn payable to bearer and signed with a name that I can't mention, though it's one of the points of my story. But it was a name at least very well known and often printed. The figure was stiff, but the signature was good for more than that. If it was only genuine, I took the liberty of pointing out to my gentleman that the whole business looked apocryphal, and that a man does not, in real life, walk into a cellar door at 4 in the morning and come out of it with another man's cheque for close upon £100. But he was quite easy and sneering. Get your mind at rest, says he. I will stay with you till the bank's open and cash the cheque myself. So we all set off, the doctor and the child's father and our friend and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers. And next day, when we had breakfasted, went in a body to the bank. I gave in the cheque myself, said I had every reason to believe it was a forgery. Not a bit of it. The cheque was genuine. So they threaten this guy, and the guy says, okay, I'll give you the money. And he goes into this mysterious gate, this haunted house looking place, and comes out with a check in the name, they haven't said it yet, but obviously they will soon, in the name of someone who should be pretty respected. And they don't think that this strange, monstrous villain is that guy. They think, oh, he must have a weird connection with that guy. Or at first they think he's just faking it. But they take it to the bank and they say, look, we don't think this is real. So the bank gives it extra scrutiny. And the bank says, yeah, you know what? It's real. Tut, tut, said Mr. Utterson. I see you feel as I do, said Mr. Innsfield. Yes, it's a bad story. For my man, it was a fellow that nobody could have to do with, a really damnable man. And the person that drew the check is very pink of the proprieties. Celebrated, too, and what makes it worse, one of your fellows who do what they call good. Blackmail, I suppose, an honest man paying through the nose for some of the capers of his youth. Blackmail House is what I call that place with the door, in consequence. Though even that, is far from explaining all, he added, and with the words fell into a vein of musing. From this he was recalled by Mr. Utterson asking rather suddenly, "And you don't know if the drawer of the check lives there?" "A likely place, isn't it?" returned Mr. Innsfield. "But I happen to have noticed his address. He lives in some square or other." "And you never asked about the place with the door," said Mr. Utterson. "No, sir, I had a delicacy," was the reply. "I feel very strongly about putting questions. It partakes too much of the style of the Day of Judgment. You start a question, and it's like starting a stone. You sit quietly on the top of the hill, and away the stone goes, starting others, and presently some bland old bird, the last you would have thought of, is knocked on the head in his own back garden, and the family have to change their name. No, sir, I make it a rule of mine, the more it looks like Queer Street, the less I ask." So now, they took the check to the bank. It was real. And Infield is thinking, how did he get that check? How did he get a respectable name to sign off on it? How does he know this guy in the first place? And he thinks maybe it's blackmail. Like maybe the respectable man did something years ago that he owes a favor to this monstrous, villainous man. And he doesn't really live in this haunted house looking place. He lives somewhere else, but he must own that property in some roundabout way. Again, maybe connected to a strange incident in the past. But Infield says, well, it's none of my business. I had a delicacy, meaning I treat these things delicately. I don't push it. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to lead to something that would make a fuss. "A very good rule, too," said the lawyer. And we know from the first paragraph that the lawyer is probably this kind of guy as well. He doesn't really go out of his way to cause trouble. He just hears stories with no judgment. And in fact, he pretty much likes everybody who's willing to talk with him. "But I have studied the place for myself," continued Mr. Enfield. "It seems scarcely a house. There is no other door, and nobody goes in or out of that one but once in a great while, the gentleman of my adventure. There are 3 windows looking on the court on the first floor. None below. The windows are always shut, but they're clean. And then there is a chimney which is generally smoking, so somebody must live there. And yet it's not so sure, for the buildings are so packed together about that court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins." The pair walked on again for a while in silence, and then "Enfield," said Mr. Utterson, "that's a good rule of yours." "Yes, I think it is," returned Enfield. "But, for all that," continued the lawyer, "there's one point I want to ask. I want to ask the name of that man who walked over the child." "Well," said Mr. Enfield, "I can't see what harm it would do. It was a man of the name of Hyde." Said Mr. Utterson. "What sort of man is he to see?" "He is not easy to describe. There is something wrong with his appearance, something displeasing, something downright detestable. I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why. He must be deformed somewhere. He gives a strong feeling of deformity, although I couldn't specify the point. He's an extraordinary looking man, and yet I really can name nothing out of the way. No, sir, I make no hand of it. I can't describe him. It's not want of memory, for I can declare I can see him in this moment." Mr. Utterson again walked some way in silence and obviously under a weight of consideration. "You are sure he used a key?" he inquired at last. "My dear sir," began Enfield, surprised out of himself. "Yes, I know," said Utterson. "I know it must seem strange. The fact is, if I do not ask you the name of the other party, it is because I know it already. You see, Richard, your tale has gone home." If you've been inexact at any point, you had better correct it. I think you might have warned me, returned the other with a touch of sullenness. But I have been pedantically exact, as you call it. That fellow had a key, and what's more, he has it still. I saw him use it not a week ago. Mr. Utterson sighed deeply, but said never a word, and the young man presently resumed. Here's another lesson, say nothing, said he. I'm ashamed of my long tongue. Let us make a bargain, never to refer to this again. With all my heart, said the lawyer. I shake hands on that, Richard. So, we hear a story about a guy, a strange, violent, ugly guy that when people see him, they just hate him. They just want to beat him up and threaten him. And apparently he's not too different in return. And this guy came out of a house, trampled over this child in the street, just completely animalistically. And then when he had to pay a little, what could we call it, a fine for this, he went into a nice house, got a check, and it was real, so he has some connection to the owner of this nice house. Now, of course, if you know the story, you probably have a head start on what's going on, but the characters, all they know is that this man is not sneaking in. He's not stealing the money. He really has access to the house. He really has access to the money. And he really is just hateable. Infield said he couldn't describe the man. I mean, he's clearly a human, and there's nothing obviously off. It's not like he's green or something, but when you look at him, you just think, this guy is disgusting. Maybe it's something hard to notice, like his eyes are a little too far apart, or his teeth are a little too pointy or something, and you just subconsciously feel the fear. But that's the first chapter, and it's, even though I took forever because I stopped to describe things, it's pretty short, and the next chapter is equally short. And the plan is I'm going to ask you guys to read chapter 2. So I read 1, you can read 2, either the normal way, just read the text, or you can listen to this audio, or you can find several different audio versions on YouTube, and so on. This means we are covering 2 chapters this time. We'll do 1 chapter sometimes, or 2. That will easily get us to the end before school's out, and we can have a few weeks at the end to review, take a quiz, all that good stuff. I'm going to end this video now, and I'm going to post an assignment next time that has some questions over chapter 1 and 2.